Hi everyone. Welcome to a fireside chat based on the opaque fleet. It's really been 12 months already since Europe imposed an import ban on Russian crude. And following that, we've released the brand new opaque fleet report, which essentially gives updates on the tanker fleet and updates around the flows, the fleet itself, and also the fleet profile. And following this, there's been quite significant updates that happened in the last 12 months since the ban was imposed. And I think really somewhere to start here would be actually looking at the operators involved in the trade. So Mary, I want to hand it over to you the first question really. So what's been the change we've seen in the European operators involved in this trade, let's say in the last 12 months since the ban was imposed?
Mm-hmm. So I think for us in the past year, the real inflection point came when we saw Urals assessed above the price cap in mid-July and Russian diesel assessed above the price cap at the start of August. And at that point, we saw a divergence in the behavior for European operators, whether they were on the crude side or the diesel side. So almost immediately when Urals went above the cap, the volume of Russian crude lifted by European operators declined significantly and has since remained low. But when Russian diesel went above the cap, the share lifted by European operators actually continued to increase and hit almost 50% in October. And it's not actually until this past month in November that we saw any change. And now we're seeing a substantial decline on European involvement in the Russian diesel trade, likely from fear of tougher sanctions enforcement after we've seen some of that action by the US Treasury. So now we're seeing kind of the overall fleet and the makeup of that overall fleet trading in Russia starting to change. So that brings me to a question for you, Armen. So how have you seen just the overall opaque fleet change over the last 12 months?
Yeah, great question, Mary, and great update as well. So I think how we've seen the opaque fleet change in the last 12 months is there's been significant growth within the fleet. We've seen the fleet now, the total fleet surpass 1,600 tankers. It's including all tankers involved in the Iranian, Venezuelan, and the Russian trade since the respective EU bans. And this dates back to January 2021 for Iran and Venezuela, and Russia since the respective bans. Now that number past 1,600 is quite significant. And the reason for that is because when we look at the activity of these tankers on a quarterly basis, we've actually seen the second quarter of this year was really the peak. We saw over 1,000 tankers from this fleet actually operate within that quarter alone. Now, based on our data and analysis, that was the peak of activity. That includes all port calls and STS activity. And why that second quarter is so important this year is because that's the same quarter that we saw the opaque fleet's crude exports peak. We saw it hit just over 5.7 million barrels a day. And that's also significant to global crude markets because it's actually a growing share of the wider crude export market. It's accounted for nearly 20% of all exports from the top 10 crude exporters from the world. So a significant number. It has declined since slightly, as has the activity of the fleet in recent quarters, which suggests we might see declining activity moving forward, moving into the new year. But it's significant shift in the overall size of the fleet. And I think a third point to raise here as well is there's been a significant shift within the fleet itself as well. So if we look back to when the war started in March of 2022, what we start to see were tankers shifting away from Iran and Venezuelan trade into the Russian trade. And we've seen that as an ongoing phenomenon. Based on our data, we've seen 146 tankers make this switch from Iran and Venezuela into Russian trade. It's just under 10% of the overall fleet. And it really raises the point of how operators are just familiar with the tactics of moving their tankers within these trades. And also quite interesting as well, we've seen about 35% of those tankers that moved into Russian trade switch back into Iranian Venezuelan trade over the last 12 months. It really highlights the fluidity of these operators and their ability to actually move tankers within the trades to really wherever the money talks for the operators involved. And actually talking to the point of Iran and Venezuela, it kind of leads me to my next question to Yanis. So I had a question, recently we've seen the US ease sanctions on Venezuela. What do you see the impact being on the tanker fleet market moving forward if these sanctions ease persists?
Thank you, Armen. Of course, this is a big question mark. Although recently we saw this US sanction lift on Venezuela. And what we decided to do is actually run a scenario analysis to see the impact on tanker demand, especially for the main vessel classes. Of course, what do we expect from Venezuela in terms of level of exports because of main challenges and difficulties and underinvestment on the production side? We're expecting that crude export will remain flat on recent levels, at least in the short to medium term. However, our most likely scenario is that these exports will sail in all of different types of destination when it comes to milets. We're expecting exports to be split between Chinese buyers, European buyers, Indian buyers, as well as the US, which is something, of course, that we have seen as far as recently. And this will actually provide an equal generated demand split between VLCCs, especially going to this Indian and to these Chinese long-haul destinations, as well as Aframax for the more shorter haul routes of Europe and the US. We're expecting an addition of 13 VLCCs and Aframax in this case for this mainstream demand, right? And then we have some more edge case scenarios where we're expecting, because of price competitiveness reasons, to see more exposure for buyers in proximity to Venezuela, which are also quite in need of this heavy crude, such as the Europe and the US. And in this case, what we would see is a higher exposure on the shorter haul destinations, which could see up to 20 additional Aframax tankers in terms of demand coming from this mainstream trade. Now, of course, apart from talking about the repercussion of the mainstream trade, one interesting thing that we have to note is that at the same time, we have seen around 60 VLCCs, 30 Aframaxes, and around 20 Suezmaxes that have been carrying Venezuelan crude to China over the past year, from October 2022 to October 2023. Hence, if like these scenarios materialize, especially the last scenario, we might see that these vessels of the opaque fleet might find it quite difficult to actually find deployment within the mainstream trade. And hence, this could create a tonnage supply squeeze on the opaque market, which actually could trigger higher demolition activity. But as said in the beginning, still it is a big question mark to see on what terms and on what levels these US sanctions will be lifted on Venezuela, at least on the long term. So with that, let's circle back to Russia. And Mary earlier on discussed a bit about the profile of the tanker operators that are actually participating in this market. However, it's interesting to see whether there has been any different types of behavior when looking about the routes where these participants are actually operating, especially after carrying Russian oil. So my next question is to you, Dylan, and I was wondering whether you could give some insights, or where are these tankers sailing after leaving the Russian trade?
Thanks, Yanis. Yes, sure. Mary touched on it earlier that we saw some change in the fleet dynamics after the price cap was sort of assessed, or the prices of diesel was assessed above the price cap, and we saw less EU operators in the fleet. But what we're also seeing is, just in general, we're seeing tankers actually exit the trade permanently. So on the Ural side, what we've seen is a lot of tankers move into the Persian Gulf, as well as East Med and also Black Sea oil trades after carrying Urals post the ban, but have not re-entered the trade up until the end of November. And on the diesel side, we also see the same thing, where some of the MR tankers that were previously involved in Russian diesel trade have moved over to Persian Gulf trade, as well as European trade, so East and West Med, and also Northwest Europe. And a small proportion actually going to as far as Asia Pacific markets, so operating in the East and Southeast Asia ports as well. Now, what's interesting about the Persian Gulf trade is, especially for Russian crude, is we saw that as sort of a temporary option for Russian tankers. And we saw them do those trades in between Russian cargoes. But at the moment, what we're seeing is, as we see a rise of levers, we also see a rise of permanent moves into that, especially into the Middle Eastern trade. So you're starting to see less fluidity and more rigidity between the mainstream and the opaque markets. So there you have it, a summary of some of the key topics of our opaque fleet report. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in to this Fireside Chat. Of course, you can download the full report on our website if you want to read more. And we hope to see you again very soon. Bye for now.